Shabana Kagu, the chairperson of Working in Sri Lanka, Sanjeeva Weerawarana, Nayana Samaranayaka, the co-founders of Working in Sri Lanka, Rasita Wickramaratne, all the volunteers, and all those who are participating, ladies and gentlemen. I looked at the program and I looked at the topic that was assigned to me, and I'm going to speak a little bit more widely than the topics. I might say that at the outset. I have also the privilege of speaking in front of my former boss, Mr. Ranjit Fernando, who is now the chairman of the Urban Development Authority and past chief executive officer of the National Development Bank Group. And I was fortunate enough to be picked up from the private sector where I worked for Citibank, and then later went on to head the National Development Group too. So you are fortunate that you're going to have some very good keynote speakers who will probably, unlike me, stick to the topic more strictly. Right at the outset, I want to say, I understand that this is the third conference that is being held, and that this conference is being held in a new environment, in a new Sri Lanka. January 8th, I think, was a big change. If I came to you or the average person on the street and I said a year ago that there was going to be a big political change in this country, hardly anybody would believe it. I came into politics myself on the invitation of the United National Party in 2010. When I was stepping out, everybody said, "Don't do it, you're foolish, change is not possible." But I really came because I thought that change was necessary. One reason that change is necessary is that nearly 300,000 Sri Lankans make their way out of Sri Lanka annually, leaving this country for greener pastures overseas, and different people have different reasons to do so. On average, we lose, of that 300,000, about 7.5% are really professionals and people who the country really needs to steer the country's future. In addition to that, we lose semi and skilled people, which is about another 1/3 of those who actually leave the country. Then between 55 to 60% are unskilled and domestic workers. Ideally, we need them all. Ideally, we need them all, because we even have shortages in the unskilled area in this country, and you'd realize that very quickly if you get into any kind of a factory or manufacturing concern. But pardon me for being biased, we need our professionals, we need the educated, and we need them more, because we need people to steer the ship. As you are aware, our new government after January 8th has welcomed overseas Sri Lankans back, because there is a clear recognition that to steer this country after the political revolution has to be an economic revolution. If the economy does not deliver the changes that we have achieved in the political arena, will unravel itself with time. So we need capital and we need technology. but most of all, we need management. This may not be very widely recognized, but we certainly need management. Everywhere I go, people are talking about capital and technology. But having had the privilege of working for a multinational corporation, part of my working career, I could see the great need is actually management, and actually management which has been exposed internationally. So as an incentive in welcoming people back home, our new government has reintroduced the dual citizenship window from March 2015. As you know, it was suspended in 2011. We've also simplified the tax system, and there are many, many simplifications, and I won't go into the details of it. But the individual tax-free allowance, which was 500,000 rupees up till now, has in this budget been increased to 2.4 million rupees. In terms of the purchasing power of the average person living in this country, I think this is a very significant, in fact, revolutionary move to increase the tax-free threshold by several fold. We've also, for those who are earning above that threshold, the system has been simplified. Instead of having a progressive tax rate, a flat tax rate of 15% is going to apply beyond the tax-free allowance. We've also eliminated many other taxes, some of which are share transaction levy, construction industry, the guarantee fund levy, and then also luxury and semi-luxury motor vehicle taxes. Also to encourage entrepreneurship and investment or capital, for those who are setting up venture capital firms, we are reduce the tax rate to be 50% of the corporate tax rate, and that will be initially for a period of 5 years. This is to encourage investment in the country. There are many other features, why somebody could choose to come back here. Now, it is unusual to talk about the frustrations first. The biggest frustration probably when you come is when you get off the airport. Unlike some years ago, you start with a pleasant drive into the city up to the Calania Bridge, and then your frustration begins. As you can see, we have too many vehicles on the road. I have a ministry office in the World Trade Center here, and I have this same problem I'm describing to you now this evening that I have to face. And when I finish my work there, I have to be in my constituency, which is in the suburbs of Colombo in Moratuwa, and I come out in the evening, and it takes me 2 hours just to drive down the Gaul Road at peak time from here to Moratuwa. Whereas, which I now often do, I turn my car, I go to the Fort railway station, and I get on a train, and it takes me 40 minutes. But I wouldn't be recommending the train journey to you, because if you're a woman, it's an impossibility, and if you're a guy, then it's really, really tough. There's hardly any breathing space, leave alone your ability to do any work in the 40 minutes. So we have had what I would call wrong policy in encouraging lots of private transport and congesting the road, making it inefficient and polluting the environment, whereas we should have been investing in public transport. Our government has a plan, and it's a long-term plan, to invest in public transport. But unfortunately, we're going through at least a 2-year period post January 8th, in which the economy will have to go through many reforms and adjustments before we could actually invest in public transport and other such necessities. However, on a more pleasant note, Sri Lanka has a good education system, particularly for those who are going to primary and secondary schools. We have government schools which are well sought after and extremely difficult to get in because of the competition. We have also permitted over the last 20 years a private education system, which is really private education, sometimes called international schools. This is really backdoor private education. And I'm sure you're aware of it, and I would recommend the standards of most of those schools as really good. For those who definitely would have concerns if you are returning, particularly with the education of your children. The health system has also improved. While there has been underinvestment in education and health over the past decade in the public sector, in the private sector it has certainly improved. You'll notice very quickly that there are many private hospitals, and therefore healthcare has improved. There are many who visit this country now on health tourism and are using our private hospital system. Housing has also improved, and particularly middle-class housing. While there is a lot of pressure on things like land, and I'm sure Mr. Ranjit Fernando might be able to elaborate a lot more, there's certainly a lot of choice in terms of middle-class housing and also at affordable prices. So there is a range of it. And it's the lifestyle. You say, if you've been working in New York or in London, you know the hustle and the bustle, or somewhere in Asia, in Tokyo or some other city, I think there's still much to be desired of the lifestyle in this country. So the change that has occurred here is primarily to do with the establishment of the rule of law. One of the first things the new President Maithripala Sirisena did on the assumption of office is to reinstate the Chief Justice of the country, who had been unethically and illegally, in my own view, removed from office of interference of the executive in the judiciary. And now we have a chief executive who is the most senior judge on the bench of the Supreme Court, and we have upheld that principle. It is an adjustment period. There are many bumps on the road. However, through the 19th Amendment, we have rebalanced the powers of the President with the powers of the legislature. We are on a journey to abolish the executive presidency and reinstate the supremacy of Parliament. On the 9th of January, Parliament is being recalled and will be turned into a constituent assembly so that Sri Lanka will forge ahead with the constitutional reforms it needs. This has truly been a peaceful transition, even though there were many questions on the night of the 8th of January, which will be investigated at some point in the future. However, everybody is thankful that it ended up a peaceful transition. We are in an anti-corruption drive. There are many things you will hear about the anti-corruption drive. Most will say, much is not happening. It's too slow. Where are those who have robbed being brought to justice? Others will say, you need to be careful. It should not be a political witch hunt. I do agree to some extent with all those arguments. It is a difficult road to travel, but the law must be applied, and the law must be applied equally to everybody, from the president to the man walking on the street. That's not easy for a country who has had impunity for a considerable period of time. But now the rule of law must prevail, and therefore our government is committed to uphold the rule of law. I know that I have to talk about Public Sector 2020, and I happen to be the Deputy Minister of the Public Enterprises Development Ministry. It's a new ministry created by this government, and lots of public commercial institutions have been put under our ministry. I asked myself the question, why was this ministry created? And I think one reason this ministry was created is to reduce the political interference in commercial enterprises that are owned by government. As you know, in many countries, including ours, that enterprises are put under different ministries. And with the pressure to employ people, the public sector is bloated because of political interference. So this is one way to look at it is it's an experiment to see if that situation could be corrected. So our ministry has the whole of the state banking sector and insurance. It also has some plantation companies, including the two large state plantations, SPC and JEDB. It also has many industries, some part of the service sector, including hotels and hospitals, and it also has the airlines. So it's a big basket of institutions that we have been tasked with. So the question is, what do we actually do with these? We have to ask ourselves the fundamental question as to, should the government actually be in these industries? Are there strategic industries which we should retain government ownership? And then are there non-strategic ones in which we should divest ownership because others could do a better job than we could do ourselves? So virtually all of these industries that I talked about and government-owned companies, they require capital, they require technology. But I come back to the point I made right at the outset. Most of all, it needs good management. And it needs management which is internationally exposed. A few months ago, I was the Deputy Minister for Investment Promotion, and I was in Singapore. And I was having several discussions in Singapore, and I was asking myself the question, which many Sri Lankans have probably asked, why can't we be like Singapore? When Lee Kuan Yew, the father of modern Singapore, set sail here in Colombo, and he walked out and he saw this city, he said, my dream is to make Singapore like Colombo. We know the story 50 years later, right? Being right up there in the Asian table, probably only next to Japan, we've fallen to the bottom of that league. What went wrong? Who is responsible for what went wrong? Often it was making the wrong policy decisions, which would have been unpopular at that time, but with governments which did not have the will to hold on to those policy decisions. We have hard decisions to make now, and there are many hard decisions that we have to make, some of which are in the public sector arena. So we need internationally exposed management. I asked myself in Singapore, what's the difference? And one difference was Singapore has the management which is internationally exposed, and we do not have that management, and there is a gap. So what is one quick way of actually not closing the gap but narrowing the gap is to invite Sri Lankans who are living overseas, who have been exposed to international environments, worked in multinational corporations, to bring back their skill sets so that we can slowly begin to close that gap. I always say that this is the critical difference. I know when they come, their investments and technology will follow, but I think we really need their management. So there's much to be done in the state banks. Basel III, as you know, is coming. There'll be new capital requirements. We haven't still calculated the capital requirement that over the next 3 years that will be needed. India has done the calculation, and they say that they will need $27 billion to recapitalize the Indian state banks, and they have a 3-year plan. So we haven't done that, so we will need that. Plantations, a lot needs to be done. The airlines, which I last week offered to President Mahinda Rajapaksa for 1 rupee if he wanted to buy Mihin Air. I did not say it then, but I might say it now. Maybe he can rename it, not Mihin Air, but Mahin Air, if he likes to. But that just explains to you the state of some of the institutions that we have. Many people throw political slogans at you and say, are you privatizing? Why are you privatizing? Why are you selling state assets? That's the argument that compelled me to say, if you want to buy the airline, we will give it to you at 1 rupee. Just to explain the point that there's no point having a broken car. If I could not reach this conference this morning, I need to have a car that works. So therefore, we are going into this with an open mind, not with a preset agenda. And I want to make sure that there is transparency when we deal with these public state institutions. Now finally, you are making a decision, and I want to commend this volunteer organization. You're making a decision, and I want to commend you for what you are doing in encouraging people to come back. You cannot make this decision purely on numbers, on economics and finance. They don't always add up. The numbers don't add up when you make this decision. I played cricket in the green fields of Kent in England. I enjoyed the carefree lifestyle and the intellectual stimulation that I received at the University of London. I loved the cultural diversity and the international atmosphere that prevailed there. From West End theatre to the rabble-rousing speeches at the time I was in university of the young Robert Mugabe, who came from the prisons of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. I loved the anonymity that gave me the freedom to do as I liked without interference from anybody different from our culture. But actually, what made me come back when everyone else was heading out after the unfortunate events of Black July in 1983 was not numbers, it was not profit, it was not logic. It was an inner voice that said, it's right to return, there's much to do, life is short, give something back. It was years later in 2010 when I again made the move from private sector CEO to take a seat in the Sri Lankan Parliament. I was subsequently told that I was the first chief executive officer of a public quoted company to take a seat in the history of the Sri Lankan Parliament, only to be confronted in 2014 by a gun-trotting man at the Magampura Hambantota port, which I visited on an inspection. But why did I go into politics? Again, the numbers didn't add up, but the inner voice said it's right to do it. May you find peace in making that decision. May it be sensible, but most of all, may it be the right decision. Do it because it's right. Thank you again for inviting me. Have a pleasant day.